welcome to some more questions and answers here on the Old Front Line. These are questions submitted by you, the podcast listeners, and each month we select some of the best questions that have been submitted via email and the Discord server to answer here and hopefully give us all fresh perspectives and new knowledge of this vast subject of the Great War. So let's begin. This is our first question and answer episode of Season 8 of the podcast, and your questions continue to come in. Again, I'm absolutely astonished by the breadth of the questions and the depth of the questions as well, covering all kinds of different subjects. So keep those questions coming in. There's been a lot of kind of follow-on response to the special that we did on World War I Army ancestors, and I'm sure we're going to return to aspects of that in future Q&A episodes. But as always, if you want to send a question in, and there's no such thing as a stupid question, so if there's something you've always wanted to ask, or you've listened to episodes and it's prompted some questions in your mind, send those questions in. And you can do so via the two main methods, which is via the Discord server and via email. And links to both of those are in the show notes of this episode. So let's get down to our first question that comes from Roy Johnson from Norway on email. And he asks, there is one topic I struggle to find knowledge about, the quiet parts of the Western Front. That front was roughly 450 miles long, with trench systems on both sides. It would be interesting to know a little more generally about the quiet parts of the front. How was daily life there? What units manned these areas? Was there rotation from active areas? And how big were the troop formations in these sectors? Well, this is a great question. The Remarque novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, kind of gave that idea that there were quiet parts of the front where not a lot was happening. And if we look at all 450 miles of the Western Front that was formed during that first winter of the Great War of 1914-15, there was action along most parts of that front during that early phase of the conflict, when the lines were established, the trenches were dug, no man's land was formed. And there's a huge variation in terrain there, from the beaches of Flanders, the flatlands of northern France, the rolling downlands of the Somme, and working our way down into what was the bulk of the Western Front from the Allied perspective, defended by French soldiers, with all kinds of terrain, from vast open fields in the Champagne, river valleys like the Aisne and the Marne, forested areas like Argonne, areas with fortifications on high ground like Verdun, and then you get beyond Nancy, heading down towards the Vosges, and it becomes more and more hilly, and then eventually mountainous when you get to places like Lelange and Hartmannswillerkopf in the Vosges, ending in the plain beneath that mountainous area on the borders with Switzerland. So lots of different terrain, and that meant essentially there were lots of different battlefields. And while in the early phase of the conflict there had been fighting in most, if not all, of those areas to establish these forward positions that ended up in the deadlock of trench warfare, as the war progressed, it was clear that in certain areas, because of the geography often, you were not going to win the war there. Attacking in the mountains of the Vosges, although there were battles there, proved to be fruitless, really. Heavy losses with virtually no or very little terrain taken. You were not going to win the war on the Western Front in terrain like that, which is why you see it focused on key areas, often key areas where the infrastructure on both sides was located. So in March 1918, the Germans broke through on the Somme front near Saint-Quentin, pushed across those old Somme battlefields, heading towards the key city of Amiens, because they knew that was a main rail junction and supply point for the British, and if they could overrun things like that, they could potentially reduce and diminish the British Expeditionary Force's ability to supply itself and keep itself going on the Western Front, or again in offensives like March and April of 1918, they often attacked on the join of Allied lines, so the point where British and French forces were located, to try and push away through there. So that meant when we look at the areas where key battles took place, they tended to be in limited areas of the Western Front, which meant there were effectively, as you've suggested, long areas, probably hundreds of miles of the front when you add them all together, where there were no major battles at all from that early period through to the end of the conflict, when the front eventually collapsed and trench warfare came to an end. So what happened on those quiet fronts? Well, although they were quiet in inverted commas, that didn't mean there wasn't daily activity. I often refer to it as the day-to-day activities of trench warfare, and this can be sniper activity, blazing away with your own personal weapons, random machine gun fire, rifle grenades, trench mortars, artillery. Once gas became a weapon, that could be used on fronts like this. So there could be all kinds of activity which would result in casualties. So although there were no major battles, that didn't mean there weren't losses on these parts of the front. It wasn't always a case of live and let live. There were parts of the front like that. For example, on the Somme, after the big battles of Serre-Hebuterne in June of 1915 on the northern part of the Somme battlefields, when the British arrived there that summer to take over from French troops, they found many sectors, particularly in areas like Beaumont-Hamel, where the trenches were at ocean villas facing the German positions around Hawthorne Ridge and Hawthorne Ridge. They found there that the French had kind of left the Germans alone, and the Germans, the Württembergers who were there, had kind of done the same thing. And I remember going to the Württemberg archives back in the 80s and finding this incredible sketch where a German soldier had sketched and painted the entire sector from near Thiapval across to Beaumont-Hamel up to the other side of Hawthorne Ridge towards Serre. And that kind of activity, painting like that, observing like that, and the nature of what was depicted in that painting clearly showed that it was, in inverted commas, a quiet sector. The British point of view from most of their part of the Western Front, which went from tens of miles in the winter of 1914-15, extending from Saint-Loire down to the La Bassée Canal. Eventually that would be more than 100 miles of the Western Front. And again, even at its peak, the French army was still holding the bulk of that line. We have to remember this. But from the British perspective, there was no such thing as a quiet front. The enemy wire was our front line. No man's land had to be dominated. And when you read the war diaries of units that served in that part of the Western Front, the British sector that we call the Forgotten Front, so from Armentières down to Loos, in periods where there was no major activity going on there were lots of trench raids, night patrols, and the enemy doing the same, so keeping both sides keeping each other on their toes. So what happened on the British part of the line, to answer your question about the rotation of troops, how long were they manned, what units manned them? In the British sector, men were moved around all the time. A soldier could arrive at Ypres, spend some time there, then be moved to Loos, then be moved to the Somme, then be moved to Arras, and they could be all over the front. If we look at any battalion of the British Army, they serve in a wide part of that British sector. The Germans tended to keep their men in a sector for quite a long time. The Bavarian troops, of which Adolf Hitler's unit, for example, was a part, served on the Albers Ridge for over a year, from when they moved down from near Messines and Witscherte to take over that sector on the Albers Ridge around villages like Fromelles, for example. And they spent a good calendar year in that sector not being moved at all. So units would get to know the sector, know how to defend it, build up the infrastructure of it, and you can see evidence of that in that ground today. And the Germans felt that was a better way to defend on the Western Front. The French tended to keep units in one particular area, but of course as the war went on and they find themselves fighting major battles in the Champagne and with the defence of Verdun, units are in the French army rotated in exactly the same way that they are to an extent in the British army, because the French have to move as many men into a given area to either attack or defend that bit of ground. And when the Americans arrived in 1917, they took over some of the quieter sectors to sort of become acclimatised to trench warfare. And even in 1918, there were some American units down in the Vosges in what they called the defensive sector, where they held bits of the line there to free up French units that then could be sent elsewhere to attack in that final phase of the conflict along the Western Front. In terms of how big the troop formations were in this area, there were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of men holding trench systems in quiet, so-called quiet sectors of the Western Front. So we're not talking about small numbers here. And in terms of a soldier's experience, a soldier could go to a sector like that, even in the Ypres salient, during that quiet period from mid-1915 to mid-1917, in between the second and the third battles of Ypres. You could arrive in a sector like that, go into the line, do months of trench warfare, never ever fire your weapon or throw a grenade or fix a bayonet and then be killed or wounded. That was your contribution to the Great War. So the idea that soldiers were fighting big battles all the time is kind of a myth of the First World War. And yet again, with all these excellent questions, perhaps a podcast episode in its own right. So thanks for that great question, Roy. And while I'm sure I've answered a little bit of what you were asking there, I'm sure it's posed as many questions as it's answered, which is typical when we look at the study of something as complex as the First World War. So we'll move on to question 2, and this comes from Chris Skoll on email. How blurred was the line between the civilian areas behind the lines and the front lines on the Western Front? Was it ever the case where non-combatants would wander into 45 positions and trench lines just to look around while action was taking place? Well, when we look at the formation of the Western Front in those early years of the First World War, I think then the lines were much more blurred. The British were quite reluctant to move civilians away from the battle area. They felt they had no lawful command over them. That was particularly true in Belgium, where the citizens of Ypres, for example, continued to live in the city of Ypres right up to the Second Battle of Ypres in April of 1915, and with the advent of poison gas and not enough gas masks, respirators to equip the British Army, let alone Belgian civilians, they had to be asked to withdraw from that area to go to safe areas much further back. And what that meant in that early period, and we see this reflected in quite a lot of soldiers' memoirs that talk about this, where civilians do get into the trench system. There are accounts of newspaper boys, for example, coming into the trenches to sell newspapers to the soldiers in the forward area of the battlefield. And then people just randomly turning up. And the security implications of that were obvious. And again, in that early period, it kind of prompted a kind of craziness, really, that civilians were spying on British forces, Allied forces, and relaying that information to German intelligence officers on the other side of the battlefield. And I think that when we kind of scratch the surface of that, not enough work in my mind has ever been put into looking at the intelligence war on the Western Front. There are a few books on it, but not enough really. But I think that if you look at that kind of activity, really it just wasn't happening, that it was imagined. They thought that if Madame Lefebvre put out a line of washing with a red sheet, a blue sheet and a pink sheet, that sent some signal to some German officer on the other side of no man's land. And even the positioning of cows or horses in a field was seen by some people as an attempt by the owners of those to relay information to the enemy. So what you see is a kind of knee-jerk reaction to this and the movement of civilians away from the fighting area. So that was on the kind of British side of no man's land. And as the war progressed, the civilians got further and further away from where the front lines were located. We've just had an episode on the village of Meilly on the Somme, for example, which was just behind the British front line at Ocean Villas, Beaumont-Hamel, Hawthorne Ridge and Serre. And probably when the French were there in the early part of the war, the villagers were still living in Meilly. When the British arrived, they were gone. They were much further back. And the British extended that on most parts of their front as the war progressed, because there were obvious dangers to the civilians, and again there was this fear, security fear, that somehow information could be relayed to somebody. But again, there's kind of no evidence of that. When we look at the German side of the battlefield, and we see this even through the photographs that appear in some of their contemporary books and magazines, where they show life behind the German lines on the Somme front. There's a book called An der Somme, on the Somme, for example, which is a photo book from men from the 26th Reserve Division, Württemberg unit that occupied one part of the Somme front. And we can see lots of the villages that were behind the lines. There's almost no evidence of civilians in villages like Courcelette and Martin-Puy and Grandcourt, Longueval, and all these kind of locations. They've been moved away, displaced, and a lot of French civilians on both sides of the battlefield did end up being displaced. On the Allied side, going deeper into France. On the German side, a lot go up to some of the big cities like Lille or Charleville-Mézières in eastern France. Some cross the border to go into the French-speaking parts of Belgium occupied by German forces to get away from these battle areas when they've been forced out by the Germans. But it's clear that the Germans took the security element of it very, very seriously, possibly based on their perceived idea of what happened to their troops in Belgium and parts of France when they felt they'd been shot at by civilians in the early part of the war, often leading to the massacre, the murder of civilians in many towns and villages. But the Germans just didn't want civilians anywhere near the battlefront, so they disappeared from those places that were close to the front. What you see, however, when the Germans retreated to the Hindenburg Line in that early part of 1917, and the British are following up behind in the advance to the Hindenburg Line, they overrun villages and towns where there are civilians. When they get beyond Bapaume, for example, they come into some of the villages there, and they are essentially, I don't think it's a phrase that was necessarily used at the time, they are essentially liberating some of those locations. And you see quite a lot of official photographs of civilians encountering British troops under those kind of conditions. So it wasn't that there were people that went in to have kind of grandstand views of the battles or to just kind of curiously see what the trenches were about. As the war went on, the access of civilians to the battle area was greatly restricted, and for all kinds of obvious reasons, safety, security, and you just didn't want civilians getting caught up in some of the terrific bombardments, obviously, that took place in trenches along the Western Front as that conflict moved forward into more and more of a total war. So again, the kind of whole civilian aspect is something we often touch on in some of the episodes where we look at life behind the lines, but it's a fascinating part of our understanding of the Great War, how civilians were kind of woven into this story of what was happening literally on their front door, on that landscape of the Great War, and often, sadly, paying the price. And we see that on village war memorials across France and Belgium, where we see civilian names of people killed by shelling. Allied shells, German shells. Shells didn't discriminate, unfortunately, and if civilians got in the way, then they paid the ultimate price too. So a fascinating subject, Chris, and I hope that's given you a bit of insight into the civilian experience on the Western Front in the Great War. So let's move on to question 3, and this comes from Richard Chinnis on email. Given your interest and obvious skills in photography, that's very kind of you, Richard, do you have a Great War photo you consider to be the best? Do you have a favourite photo, and are they the same? What makes a great photo? Is there a Great War photo that has impact and instant recognition factor of, for example, Joe Rosenthal's Mount Suribachi flag-raising photo? And that's one, Richard, that you're referring to, that famous photograph from the fighting at Iwo Jima, where they're raising the flag, having captured the island there in 1945. So to come back to the Great War and the idea of a best or favourite photograph, I mean, I literally could talk all day about this. Photographs have always obsessed me. When I was early on in my journey of discovering and researching the Great War, I used to go to the photographic department of the Imperial War Museum, where they had all the official photographs in vast albums, and you could sit there and browse them to your heart's content and make notes and get copies of them. And I spent many, many hours doing that. So if we just kind of focus on those official photographs, which have become part of the defining archive, the defining vision of how we view the First World War through images taken by official photographers on the battlefields. And if you look at the artwork that I use, the main show artwork for the Old Frontline podcast, I use a still from a series of photographs that were taken when the Scottish Rifles launched a trench raid at Arras in 1917. It's an actual trench raid. It's not a reconstruction. It's not a training ground behind the lines. It's actually in a forward sap. And I chose this photograph because I think it has become one of the most iconic images of the First World War. In fact, the whole series of those images that were taken there have become iconic images of the Great War. And I've included one that is an additional picture. It's kind of later on in the sequence of images. And what I'll do with these favourite photographs, in inverted commas, is put these onto the podcast website so you can have a look at them. The sequence of these images show a line of Scottish Rifle soldiers going up with lightly equipped with weapons to jump out of the end of a sap and get across no man's land to make their raid. But one of the pictures particularly affects me because a single soldier has turned his head round and is looking back at the cameraman. Most of the others are too occupied with what they're about to do, checking their weapons, checking their kit, thinking about what it's going to mean to go over the top in broad daylight to launch a raid onto the enemy positions. But this soldier, this anonymous soldier of the Great War, turns his head back and looks directly at the camera. And I think that is most definitely one of the photographs of the Great War. The official caption for that image is a raiding party of the 10th Battalion Cameronian Scottish Rifles waiting in a sap for the signal to go, taken by John Warwick Brooke, one of the famous photographers, official photographers of the Great War. He followed them into this sap, into which a shell fell shortly, killing several of the men, and it was taken near Arras on the 24th of March 1917. Now, there's been much debate, much research into this series of images. If you go back into early editions of Stand 2, the Journal of the Western Front Association, there is an article about it there, which is a really good one. But whatever the story is, we know this is a real action of the Great War. This is not imagined. This is not fabricated. It's not fake. It's real. And that particular image in the sequence where the soldier looks back, this has real impact to me. And like I say, I think is one of the photographs of the Great War. If I was going to pull out a few others, and again, I could talk all day, and this is a shorter podcast, so we've got to be mindful of that, and maybe this is something that we come back to again. But one of the other pictures that I think is a defining image of the Great War is one taken by an Australian official photographer, and the caption for that is "The Assault on Passchendaele, 12th of October to the 6th of November 1917, a soldier running along a corduroy track through Chateau Wood." It was originally captioned "The Way to the Front," and the Imperial War Museum website says it was probably posed. And what it shows is a single soldier bolting across the track. There's a smashed limber in the foreground, and behind him is Chateau Wood, which is on the Hawthorne Ridge just northeast of Hooge. And this route through the trees, which are matchstick trees, stumps of trees smashed by artillery fire, poisoned by gas, torn apart by shrapnel, and that route was a main route to the forward zone of the battlefield, particularly for Australian troops. They went through Chateau Wood, en route to actions around Zonnebeek and Polygon Wood in that phase of the Third Battle of Ypres that the Australians took part in September and October of 1917. And it's a very atmospheric image, and one that has kind of haunted me, and one that I thought, I wonder what there is where you could trace of that on the ground. And in fact, that little bit of ride through the trees and what was known to the British as Chateau Wood is actually still there, tucked on the edge of the Hawthorne Fun Park today. And although it looks nothing like it does in this photograph, you can match it up, you can see a clear ride, and you can see obviously the modern wood, Chateau Wood, regrown. So that, to me, again, is an absolute classic image of the Great War. And another one that has particular reference for me, it's not a particularly great photograph. It was taken by Lieutenant Brooke, Baby Brooke, looking up towards the Hawthorne Ridge. He was in a dugout with Geoffrey Malins, who was the official cinematographer, who was taking film of the explosion of the Hawthorne mine on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. and then he filmed these ant-like figures going up the slope of the Hawthorne Ridge towards the crater, and then the survivors coming back. And Brooke, by the side of him, was photographing this as well. And you've got kind of a landscape image with barbed wire and bits of forward positions and sandbags, the crest of the Hawthorne Ridge in the background. But if you look at the image, you can see these kind of ant-like figures coming back down the slope. And they are the survivors of the 16th Battalion, the Middlesex Regiment, the Public Schools Battalion, which was part of the 29th Division, who took part in the second wave of the attack on Hawthorne Ridge. And amongst the men who went up that ridge was Second Lieutenant Eric Heaton, whose story I've told many times on this podcast. He's not in this image coming back because he never came back. His body is somewhere in the grass on that ridge, and that's something I think of when I look at this image. But there is one identifiable officer. You can see him hopping over a bit of barbed wire fence using his walking stick to bash down the wire, and that's almost certainly Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton Hall, who was the only officer that walked away from that attack in the 16th Middlesex. He was the battalion commander, and he recommended a number of men for gallantry awards and was himself awarded the DSO, the Distinguished Service Order, for his bravery on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. So that one is not a very good photograph, but what's in it and what I know of it and what I know of the backstory, if you like, of that image is all part of what its power, its impact is for me. And I think that's kind of what good photographs prompts us to do, to delve deep into what they are and what they represent. And there are tens of thousands of these official images on the Imperial War Museum website. I suspect you can still go to the Department of Photographs and look through those albums. If you get a chance to do that, I would thoroughly recommend it. But photography fascinates me, and the images of that war fascinate me too. And I haven't even talked about private images, of which I've got many examples of, which also often can be incredible and impactful. So perhaps, again, photography of the Great War is something that we will return to in the podcast sometime soon. So thank you, Richard, for that brilliant question that as I've said several times, I could literally talk about for hours and hours. Question number 4 comes from an old friend of the podcast who sent quite a few really good questions in. So thank you for these. And it comes from John Thompson. John asks, every time I read about any battles of the Great War, I always think of the bravery shown by the stretcher-bearers, but also wonder, was there an unwritten rule from both sides not to shoot at the stretcher-bearers whilst in no man's land, or were they fair game? I also know that in the heat of battle and with the amount of enfilade fire, it would be difficult to not hit them. But after the battle settled and cooled off, were stretcher-bearers able to roam in no man's land to help the wounded and recover the dead if no ceasefire was arranged, or would they be picked off by one or other side? A great question. Well, stretcher-bearers wore a brassard and armband indicating that they were stretcher-bearers, and to a degree, battalion-level stretcher-bearers were protected, but you've got to remember that at battalion level in the British Army, stretcher-bearers were not non-combatants. They could be sent back to a rifle platoon at any moment, and they were often drawn by some of the more intelligent men in rifle platoons to come into the stretcher-bearer section and work there. So they weren't, strictly speaking, medical non-combatants. In an infantry battalion, there was the regimental medical officer or the battalion medical officer, the RMO or the BMO, or just the MO, the medical officer, and he was from the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he was protected under the conventions of the day. And he did wear a Red Cross brassard, a Red Cross armband, indicating that he was a medical officer, and if he had any RAMC orderlies attached to him, they would be wearing the same. Royal Army Medical Corps, if they came onto the battlefield to assist the infantry or any unit with the evacuation of the wounded, they, of course, would also have Red Cross brassards indicating that they were part of the Royal Army Medical Corps and needed to be observed to be non-combatants in that respect, because none of these men were allowed to bear arms. If you're in the Royal Army Medical Corps, you could not carry weapons into battle. The medical officer did have a pistol, a revolver, which he could use to defend the medical post if required, but they were not there to do fighting. And what you see generally is both sides respecting stretcher bearers. You don't have to go very far into the Great War literature to find stories of German snipers picking off stretcher bearers. But I think, generally speaking, from the veterans that I interviewed who witnessed this, and the many, many accounts that I've read, and the accounts that we have from stretcher bearers who served in the Great War, Frank Dunham, Long Carry, fantastic book on the Great War, tells you about the life of a regimental stretcher bearer. Then we read these kind of accounts and we see that generally both sides did observe protocol when it came to stretcher bearers, because stretcher bearers wouldn't just pick up their own wounded, they would often pick up enemy wounded. And if we look at photographs of medical establishments on the battlefields, aid posts, dressing stations, very often there's German wounded alongside British wounded. And if we looked at German images of the same thing on their side of the battlefield, we would see the same. German wounded with British captured soldiers also wounded alongside them. So both sides realised the importance of this medical personnel in the treatment of the wounded on the battlefield, and that treatment would be given to both sides irrespective of who they were. They would be looked after. That was the idea. Having said that, there were many casualties amongst these medical personnel operating on the battlefield. I remember when we were doing the work with the diggers all those years ago, we looked at some of the stories in the attacks and the fighting around Boesinger, and the 1st Somersets made an assault there on the 6th of July 1915, and their medical officer, Captain John Gwynn, I think his name was out in no man's land treating some of the wounded, patched up a soldier. He was wearing a Red Cross armband, stood bolt upright in no man's land to kind of stretch himself to move on to the next case, when a German soldier fired a shot from their positions and killed him instantly. And there were many examples. If we look at cemeteries of the Great War, we find regimental medical officers buried in many of these cemeteries, killed by enfilade fire, as you call it, from machine gun fire and rifle fire from the battlefield, killed with trench mortar fire, artillery fire, as they're going about their duties. And look at Noel Chavasse, mortally wounded by shell fire when he's going out into the water-filled craters around Wiltshire and that part of the Ypres battlefield in the opening stage of that 3rd Battle of Ypres in July and early August of 1917, and he dies of his wounds at a dressing station and becomes one of 3 men to be awarded the Victoria Cross twice. And if we look at the bravery of these stretcher bearers, it is acknowledged by the issue of medals to so many of them during the Great War. Within the RAMC, the Victoria Cross was only given to officers. I don't know whether that was a policy in the RAMC at that time, but all of the awards to medical personnel on the battlefield are all officers when it comes to the VC. In other units, they were given to a much broader spectrum of personnel. Bill Coltman, for example, who was one of the most famous ordinary soldier, other rank stretcher bearers of the Great War, was awarded the Victoria Cross, the Distinguished Conduct Medal and Bar, and the Military Medal and Bar. And his service as a stretcher bearer in the 1st 6th North Staffordshire Regiment, the Territorial Battalion, from 1915 until the end of the conflict. His VC was for an action in October 1918, so right towards the end of the fighting on the Western Front. Took him across many, many battlefields, and he saved countless lives as a stretcher bearer, and was acknowledged for that with the issue of all those medals along the way. Now, there were many others awarded MMs. I have a military medal to a lad in the South Downs battalions who was a stretcher bearer who got it for bringing in the wounded at Richborg in the attack on the Boar's Head on the 30th of June 1916. So the simple answer is yes, medical personnel were acknowledged, were recognised, and generally left to do their work, but there were many instances, many circumstances in which they became casualties on a battlefield. And it wasn't the case from the evidence that we've got that there was this widespread example of stretcher bearers being shot out of hand by either side. I'm sure that gets more complex perhaps on other theatres of war, but certainly on the Western Front that is kind of broadly speaking true. and we are going to return to the medical side of the Great War in an episode that's coming up in this season of the Old Frontline podcast. So thanks once again, John, for an excellent question. Thanks for all the questions this week. Keep them coming in, as we've said, and remember you can send them in via email or the Discord server, and links to both of those are in the show notes of this episode. See you again soon for some more questions on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.